What happens when the world's largest aid provider suddenly turns off the tap? A humanitarian crisis is unfolding across the globe as President Donald Trump's administration enforces a sweeping freeze on U.S. foreign aid, putting critical programs at risk. From field hospitals and Thai refugee camps to landmine clearance efforts in war zones and the distribution of life-saving drugs for millions suffering from HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis, the effects of this policy shift are immediate and devastating. With the U.S. accounting for 42% of all global humanitarian aid in 2024, this move has triggered panic among aid organizations, UN agencies, and vulnerable communities worldwide. The sudden freeze is part of a 90-day review period under the administration's America First policy, assessing whether U.S. assistance aligns with national interests. However, critics argue that this decision prioritizes politics over human lives, leaving millions in desperate need. The United States has long been the largest provider of humanitarian assistance, contributing an estimated $13.9 billion in 2024 to support vulnerable populations worldwide. However, with USAID, United States Agency for International Development, programs now on hold, the impact is being felt across continents, from Africa to Asia to Ukraine. This sudden funding freeze has disrupted crucial health initiatives, leaving millions at risk of losing access to essential medical care, food aid, and life-sustaining programs. As humanitarian organizations scramble to find alternative solutions, the uncertainty surrounding future U.S. commitments has raised serious concerns about the global stability of aid-dependent regions. The health crisis is especially alarming, with life-saving programs grinding to a halt. The suspension of U.S. funding has cut off antiretroviral drug supplies for 20 million people living with HIV, threatening to reverse decades of progress in controlling the virus. Support for 6.5 million orphans affected by HIV across 23 countries has also been halted, leaving many children without essential care. In addition, malaria and tuberculosis treatment programs, which rely heavily on U.S. aid, are now in jeopardy, putting millions of lives at risk. The repercussions are already evident in Thailand, where refugee clinics housing 100,000 Myanmar refugees have been forced to shut down due to a lack of funding. Atul Gawande, former head of global health at USAID, warned of the devastating consequences, stating, "These are drug supplies keeping millions alive. That stops today." The World Food Program, which relies heavily on U.S. funding, is now facing an uphill battle as the aid freeze disrupts global food assistance. The U.S. contributed $4.7 billion to the WFP last year, accounting for 54% of its budget. But with those funds now on hold, the organization is struggling to meet the growing demand. In Afghanistan, where hunger levels are already critical, 6 million people are surviving on nothing more than bread and tea, with no immediate relief in sight. In Bangladesh, while the U.S. has made an exception for emergency food aid to over 1 million Rohingya refugees, crucial support for housing and medical care remains unfunded, leaving thousands vulnerable to worsening conditions. Beyond food aid, essential humanitarian programs are also collapsing. In Syria, Myanmar, and Ukraine, the suspension of U.S.-funded landmine clearance efforts means that civilians now face greater risks from unexploded mines, further endangering war-torn communities. In Ukraine, where U.S. humanitarian aid has been a critical lifeline, programs are on the brink of collapse due to the funding freeze. Even education initiatives such as Teach for Ukraine, which helps rebuild the nation's war-stricken education system, are struggling to survive. Oksana Matiish, board chair of the program, expressed growing panic, stating, "NGOs in Ukraine are in crisis. We don't know how long we can continue." The USAID funding freeze has thrown partner organizations into chaos, forcing them to make tough decisions about their future operations. Many non-governmental organizations are grappling with whether to lay off staff, sell essential assets like vehicles and buildings, or place employees on unpaid leave. Without clear guidance, these organizations are left scrambling to cut costs. The uncertainty has also jeopardized long-term humanitarian projects, as critical programs such as refugee assistance, disease control, and food distribution face indefinite suspension. Desperate for alternatives, some groups have turned to crowdfunding to fill the funding gap. Bangkok's Freeland Foundation, which works to combat human and wildlife trafficking, launched a GoFundMe campaign to sustain its operations through the 90-day freeze. However, these efforts are only short-term solutions to a crisis with no clear end in sight. To make matters worse, USAID has imposed a strict gag order, preventing its missions from communicating with partner organizations beyond confirming the funding pause. This radio silence has left many NGOs in the dark, unsure whether to wait for a resolution or begin dismantling years of humanitarian work. The U.S. decision to cut foreign aid funding will have a devastating impact on Africa, where many nations rely heavily on U.S. assistance for health, humanitarian, and development programs. With over 6.5 million orphans and vulnerable children in 23 African countries receiving support for HIV treatment, the disruption of these services could lead to increased mortality and an exacerbation of the disease's spread. Alongside healthcare, critical programs addressing malaria, tuberculosis, and refugee support are now in jeopardy, leaving Africa's most vulnerable populations without the help they urgently need. The financial freeze will also halt life-saving programs in refugee camps and disrupt food assistance, putting even more pressure on countries already grappling with food insecurity. Nations like Somalia, South Sudan, and the Central African Republic, which depend on U.S. support for peace-building and recovery efforts, will face setbacks as the aid freeze affects security sector programs and economic development projects. The Trump administration defends the aid freeze as a necessary step to ensure U.S. taxpayer dollars are spent in ways that align with American interests. A State Department memo justifies the decision, emphasizing that President Trump will no longer allow the U.S. to blindly dole out money without tangible benefits for Americans. The memo further asserts that reviewing and realigning foreign assistance is not only a financial decision, but a moral imperative. This stance reflects Trump's long-standing America First policy, which prioritizes domestic concerns over international commitments, even in humanitarian efforts. While some governments like Georgia support the decision, believing it will curb foreign interference, critics warn that the freeze jeopardizes decades of progress in global health, refugee aid, and economic stability. Shalva Papuashvili, a Georgian official, applauded the move, claiming that international aid has at times fueled chaos rather than stability. However, humanitarian organizations, global health experts, and affected nations argue that the consequences will be devastating. By halting life-saving programs and destabilizing regions already struggling with conflict and poverty, the U.S. risks damaging its international reputation, creating humanitarian crises, and potentially fueling instability that could, ironically, harm American interests in the long run. As the 90-day review of U.S. foreign aid proceeds, aid organizations brace for the possibility of prolonged disruptions that could extend far beyond the initial freeze. Many fear that even once the review concludes, funding levels may never fully return to their previous levels, leaving vulnerable populations without crucial support. Questions loom large. Will certain programs be permanently cut? Will the freeze last longer than anticipated? How will countries that rely on U.S. assistance adapt to the new reality? While the answers remain uncertain, one thing is clear: millions of lives are at risk. From Africa to Asia to Ukraine, those who depend on U.S. aid for basic survival are facing an uncertain future as one of the world's largest aid pipelines is suddenly severed. With global humanitarian efforts hanging in the balance, the world must confront a stark reality. What price will it pay for the America First doctrine? Your perspective matters. What do you make of how the U.S. shutdown on foreign aid is hitting from Africa to Asia to Ukraine? Share your thoughts and insights in the comments section below. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to the New Africa channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our informative future videos. Stay informed, stay engaged. And thank you for watching.